Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ann Lindsley from Bel Air High School in Houston, Texas, and we are here to talk about AP Human Geography and topics in development today. Hope everyone's having a good day, and let's get started. So we're still in Unit 7. We've got one more topic on this. We're still in Unit 7 with Industrial and Economic Development. Remember, once again, we're only doing this because, even though you're not teaching it in class, we're covering Unit 7 because of its reach back into our other courses so that you can be able to use this information to extend your answers in units 2, 3, 4, and 5. So today's topic has to do with theories of development. And if you watched 2 days ago, you may see that some of this overlaps. But let's look at Ms. Brandt's questions from yesterday. All right. So first one, she asks that you describe one cultural obstacle that may prevent women working in agriculture from achieving greater equality. So agriculture unit, overarching theme of gender and culture playing a role here, achieving greater equality. So what would we be looking at here? One cultural obstacle could include women cannot own property, women's places in the home concept, women have to raise children. This would come into play in there. And let's see, the next one, identify and explain one impact of empowering women within the rural agricultural regions of developing countries. You are empowering women within rural agricultural regions. And one impact of that would be, perhaps you could say, land ownership, allowing them to control money so as to contribute to the overall income of the family. The next one, explain how high levels of a population engaged in agriculture may impact a country's ability to transition to stage 3 of the demographic transition model. So high levels of a population in agriculture. So that would imply that we're looking at subsistence agriculture and would impact a country's ability to transition to stage 3, which would mean a high degree of rural to urban migration and then also economic development. So if you have a lot of people engaged in subsistence agriculture, they're not going to be making that transition, and they're still going to be having statistically more children so as to work within that subsistence agriculture. So that's going to prevent them from expanding into a more developed phase of stage 3. All right, and then discuss how microcredit may assist women with achieving gender equality in developing countries. So here we have to have an understanding of microcredit or microloans, and how do those small loans, usually less than $100, help women develop cottage industries and then come into ownership of money and control of money themselves, to most likely use for improvements in the family or living conditions, or improvements in the community as well, to buy more materials, to make more things so they can sell more things to make more money, that kind of routine. All right, so hopefully you thought about some of those and looked at the role of gender, thought about gender, how it may impact agriculture, how it may impact development. All right, so today we are looking at spatial processes, and we're looking at how industrialization, the past and the present, facilitated improvements in standard of living, but also has contributed to geographically uneven development. So this uneven development is literally the focus of the big idea that we're seeing through here today. And in this, we also have this skill of explaining the strengths and weaknesses and limitations of different geographic models. So today, and theories. So today's topic is dealing with different theories such as Rostow's stages of economic growth, Wallerstein's world systems theory, then dependency theory and commodity dependence, to explain spatial variations in development. Development is a idea or an overarching theme that we see throughout the entire course as it's affected in each of the different units. And then spatial variations, observing and seeing spatial variations understanding causal factors for spatial variations. This is a skill. This is one of our skills that we talk about in geography. All right, so let's get started with what you need to know. So this model, maybe you've seen it if you were able to get to the development topics, or maybe if your teacher covered it in a different area. This is Rostow's model of development, model of economic development. Now, if my classes, what I would also be doing at this time is using it in conjunction with the demographic transition model, because as you move through each one of these stages, it makes sense that it's also going to affect the mobility of the population, the development individually of the population themselves, and then their approach to family size, quality of life. What also goes along with that is going to be life expectancies. And so you'll start seeing as we're going to go through each one of these. So in Rostow's model, the theorized that all developing economies will pass through 6 stages of growth and advancement. So in these, we begin with the traditional society, stage 1. And this one is the primary sector. This is subsistence agriculture. This is very limited technology, low productivity, the absence of any kind of modern technology, and there's really no change. There's no strong centralized nation concept. There's no political systems that are promoting any kind of development. And this is stage 1. In stage 2, political and economic change is beginning to occur in this transitional stage. Here we have an external demand for raw materials. So this demand for raw materials is coming from outside, from stronger countries. And I want you to really think about this particular stage, because we're gonna go back to Wallerstein's world systems theory, and then also the commodity and dependency theories, all of which are based upon being able to access raw materials from some place that is willing to produce them. The consequences of the production of those raw materials becomes a factor for those particular places. But what happens here in this transitional stage is that this particular place is providing these raw materials. And this demand from an outside country is going to initiate economic change. And by initiating economic change, it's then going to begin to promote development, particularly in the case of agricultural productivity. They're going to see other things that they can sell on the world market besides just raw materials. And what's also important to understand is that the raw resources are not being consumed by the people that are producing them. They are solely for export sale. So then the countries that are buying these raw materials come to influence political leaders. They come to heavily influence what happens in those particular countries. And this is all happening at the national level, okay? But transitional stage is essential for economic growth to continue. In the third stage, this is this takeoff period that Rostow is going to address. In this takeoff period, you have sustained growth because urbanization is increasing. Now you have a heavy rural to urban migration. There are technological breakthroughs that are being incorporated from other countries or other societies or developed themselves. The secondary sector is now developing. So recall the secondary sector is manufacturing. So they're manufacturing products a lot of times for themselves, but also for export. And they also are producing a lot more agricultural products that make things at home easier, but also can sell on the world market. So if you want to think about it, this was Great Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so then the next stage, stage 4, this drive to maturity. This is where we have specialized manufacturing, We've switched from the primary sector to the top end of the secondary sector, moving definitely into the tertiary sector for services, particularly at the government level, and then also for the companies that are involved in trade. And in this case here, in this drive to maturity, you have multiple industries which are operating within the country as well as operating in other less developed countries to obtain even more raw materials and perhaps bring those to here to further industrial expansion. So you still have the influence, though, from other stronger countries, economically stronger countries, in trying to encourage what is being produced here. But this country is now on its own as well, being part of the global trade market. It really has begun to diversify its economy so that if there's market fluctuations in some areas and downturns in the economy, the entire country will not collapse, as we've seen with some countries that have this sole dependence on one type of resource. Gold, copper, oil is a notorious one. Coal is another one. All right, so then we move to stage 5, this stage of high mass consumption. This is the age of consumer goods, or as I like to call it, the age of conspicuous consumption. And this is where I'm really missing the slides I would have done in class, because I have a whole series of slides that deals nothing but all of the conspicuous consumption items that we think we need to have. So if you're familiar with the Lorax, you'll think about the needs that we really don't need. But in this age of mass consumption, the products are products that we get can be improved upon, fancier designs, these kinds of things. But these are high mass consumption items, and they're beyond our basic needs. Now, there's a 6th level that came after the original model. And the 6th level is beyond consumption. It is the search for quality kind of thing. And it's the age of durable consumer goods, the age of durable consumer goods. Now, what that means is that we want the fancier, the better, the stronger, the aluminum instead of the heavy steel, the sleeker kinds of goods and services, or goods in particular. Those kinds of things create this need for high mass consumption. And that would be a 6th stage, which actually was implemented after the initial model was made, which is why I didn't put it on there. All right, so what does this look like? Because what we are supposed to be getting out of today's presentation is not just what these things are, but what do they look like on the landscape? How do we see differences in spatial variations of development? So I picked some various slides, images that kind of illustrate this, well, that do illustrate this. So Papua New Guinea, considered to be still a very traditional society based on subsistence agriculture, simple technology. I'm sure this is was designed here for a tourist presentation, but still it's very reflective of a traditional society. Very limited productivity levels. If we go also into Bangladesh, we see very low technology, very much subsistence, wet rice farming. If we look over on the other side where the preconditions for takeoff, we begin to see external intrusion. Can you look at these pictures carefully and see if you see any influence? Can you think about, does anyone know who is the external influence, or who was the external influence, say in the 1950s in Indochina, which is what the peninsula used to be known as? It's actually called French Indochina. Any evidence of French influence originally? And then we have almost 30 years of war that is then going to ensue. And now we have another influence into Vietnam as they begin this transition for takeoff. This external intrusion into Vietnam today is to bring about a change not only in their infrastructure, but also to increase their commercial activity on the global market. So we see a shift from agriculture to manufacturing. And I think this picture in the bottom of Hanoi really begins to show that. There are three important dimensions to this transition here for takeoff. One is, as I already mentioned, is the shift from agriculture to industrial manufacturing society. And then trade in the global market is the second factor. And then third is that money is then spent on development and infrastructure to create a commercialized economy. And all of this is happening in a period of time in this stage of preconditions for takeoff. And Vietnam right now is a really good example of how that is happening in today's world. All right, the other three, the takeoff. This is Mumbai in the 1950s, because this is when Mumbai actually went through this particular stage of dynamic economic growth and a period of time where the manufacturing sector is going to lead development. And in this particular time as well, you have a diverging of investment in part into manufacturing and global trade, and then part into maybe the population to an extent, but there's going to be some trade-offs with this period known as the takeoff. And those trade-offs are going to come in terms of what happens with populations as they continue to expand in these cities, but we'll talk about that. All right, in the drive to maturity, we begin to see industrial specialization, global trade, diversification of the economy, how technology is going to drive the economy as well. And today's best example of that is actually South Africa. They have the mineral resources, they're turning the mineral resources into manufacturing and selling their manufactured goods on the global market instead of just being an export for their own for their natural resources. Then the age of mass consumption. This was the United States in the 1950s. Post-World War II converted the wartime industries into the consumer goods industries, where you couldn't have enough stuff. And in this time period, the more stuff you had meant the better off you were, relatively inexpensive because of the use of plastics and a lot of smaller items that were available. And coming out of the age of mass consumption is going to be the development of a service sector that's now going to start pulling the economy instead of originally agriculture and then manufacturing. So now this is 1950s is when the United States actually moves toward the service sector. The United States was the first of the countries to actually move into this age of mass consumption. And those of you who may be familiar with your World War II, post-World War II history can probably understand a little bit better things of how Europe and Japan had to be redeveloped post-World War economies. And so the United States was able to shift their industries into consumer industries and not have to rebuild the country. All right. So how does this look like when we map out this data? What kind of spatial relationship? We saw the images of how these economic stages look. Now, what does it look like when we map all this out? So two particular maps that I pulled here for you. One is countries by their income groups, low income groups versus high income groups. Now, your high income groups are going to be predominantly service industries on the global market. So not just service at home, but also on the global market, as well as trade in natural resources and manufactured products, high-tech driven, whereas your low-income countries are still going to be struggling with subsistence agriculture, massively growing cities, but lots of unemployment and lots of poverty. Notice that the predominant developed or high-income countries are in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, so those of you who may be familiar with the political North-South line, Willy Brandt's North-South line, this may look somewhat familiar. Okay. Also then notice the slide at the bottom between developed and developing countries. So we can speak in terms of developed and developing, and we can see that with the developed and the developing countries, they do mirror the income groups as well. Okay, so let's talk about Wallerstein's world systems theory. There's your Willy Brandt line, by the way, the world between the North and the South, the developed world versus the less developed world. You always got to keep in mind, Australia is whatever Europe is, Western Europe. Okay, that comes with their association with the Commonwealth and former colony. All right, so we already talked about this 2 days ago, but I didn't introduce it to you as Wallerstein's world systems theory. It's the core periphery as well, but core periphery model is based upon Wallerstein's theories. So Wallerstein's world systems analysis, a system, focus on that word, is the argument that the social reality within which we live and which determines what our options are has not been the multiple national states of which we are citizens, but something larger, which we call a world system. Okay, our social reality is this world system. Okay, and this world system is divided between the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. Okay, and we talked about the difference of those the other day, so this is going to be somewhat of a review of that. So your core is your wealthy developed countries. 20 of those largest countries are the top 20 are in the, of the developed countries are part of this core. The core is extracting profits from the periphery. So what are those profits? They come from your primary sectors. Okay, trade with peripheral nations is only with a few core countries. So your countries on the periphery have the core countries that they trade with, which traditionally there is a colonial or former colonial attachment. Investment comes from the core countries. What ultimately happens, Wallerstein argues, is the poor countries become dependent on the wealthy countries, not just for investment, but also for the purchasing of their raw materials, which they need in order to continue manufacturing more goods and to provide for the population of the people. So that is also going to perpetuate products that are put out on the world market at a less expensive cost. So this is where we use labor in some of the peripheral nations because the labor costs are less. And that causes the product to become less. All right, so keep in mind that the core countries have a declining population. Keep also in mind that the core countries are motivated on a capitalist production as they are integrated into the global economy. They're powerful, they're capital intensive, meaning that they are money intensive, whereas your semi-periphery, those in purple, are contributing to manufacturing and exportation of a variety of goods, but they also benefit from the diversity of their land themselves. They can produce both manufactured products as well as a variety of agricultural products. So they have a lot of value back to the core to provide for things that the core is more expensive for the core to make or to raise themselves. They can get it from these countries for less. Okay. The other group is the semi-periphery, those in the red. And the semi-periphery is where we see the largest amount of rural to urban migration. But then on top of it, this is also where we see the fastest growth of mega cities. So the mega cities and then the meta cities, the 10 million, the 20 million in population. And these cities on top of that are having up to 2 million people in Mexico City alone, for example, have people that are living in squatter settlements, little infrastructure, rampant crime, no healthcare, massive unemployment. And this is not uncommon in the red areas of the periphery because they see that going to those cities might be a hope to improve yourself economically from what's going on in the rural countryside. So countries that we see on the semi-periphery, in particular, Cambodia, Bangladesh, sub-Saharan Africa as well as part of this. So how do we begin to see this control from this core? Well, where is this core? This core is Canada and the United States and our trade agreements. Western Europe and the function of the EU, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and their control in the eastern portion of Asia. Now, in these three cores are influencing the regional cities, but they also are influencing those particular countries as a source for raw materials and manufactured goods with a less expensive labor cost. Okay, so this is a relationship, an economic relationship between the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. Go back to that slide, which also translates into who are the developed, who are the developing, and who are the less developed countries that are evolved on our landscape. All right, so next is the dependency theory. So let's not forget what we said about Wallerstein's world systems theory with this core periphery relationship. The dependency theory is now looking at economics and social development. And in the dependency theory, this gives rise in the 1970s. And coming out of this time period, we began to see a lot of discussion about the role of former colonial areas and underdeveloped regions of the world. And the dependency theory rationale is that underdevelopment in Latin America, and by extension, parts of Africa and Asia, has been systematically created by colonist exploitation. So this is the argument of the dependency theory, that colonialism, then the independence movements, still created an economic dependency of the periphery and semi-periphery countries on the core, because these were the only places that they had been trading with, and that the core had developed this economic relationship of needing those raw materials and then selling back their goods, and that they were in this cycle that could not be changed. And in the dependency theory as well, the economic, as I said, the economic dependency of the former colonies, because of the need of the former colony to continue selling their raw material, to continue trying to stay afloat, creates a demand for a particular commodity. And in many cases, it's one commodity, or it's just a few commodities. Commodity is something that is consumed. So, and is traded on the world market, has valuation based upon market demand. So maybe you might have talked about or heard about the word commodities before. Things that are commodities are raw materials, and also some of your food products, raw food products. So cacao, coffee, tea, these are some dominant ones. Cotton is a commodity, and then your rare earth metals and some of your other ores. So copper and uranium is a rare earth metal. Cobalt is another one. So depending upon the current market demands, if you are mining, say, for example, cobalt, if you're mining cobalt, the value for that is greater today than it was 50 years ago. And in part, that's because cobalt goes into cell phones. And 50 years ago, I promise you, we didn't have cell phones. So anyway, so back to this. So the dependency theory is based upon the core periphery model, that you have this relationship between the core, the semi-periphery, for the exchange of goods and resources. And so resources come into the core, and the manufactured goods go back out to the semi-periphery and the periphery. They become their market. So in a sense, you have this cycle from the core to the periphery of materials, and the value of what the core is buying the raw materials for is less than what they're selling the final products back to the periphery and the semi-periphery. And that creates economic strife. That also creates some political tensions. So you have this circular causal factor happening. Now, the next thing that is involved with this is this concept of neocolonialism. Neocolonialism in the dependency theory is economic, and it's using the human and natural resources of a poor country to flow to the economies of the wealthy country, but they're trapped, as I said, in this circular flow. they are trapped because they've got to sell the resources. And if they don't buy the goods, then the core country is not going to buy the resources. And so they get trapped in this neo-colonial relationship. So, all right. So then the next thing that ends up happening is these countries will be led into import substitution. So import substitution is where the periphery says, okay, we've got to start developing on our own. And if we're going to develop on our own, then we can't be buying the finished product from the core. So any products coming in from the core are going to have a tariff on them. And so they're going to become more expensive. And the intention here is to cause the people in the semi-periphery and the periphery to buy domestically made products instead of buying all the goods from the core. As ideal as it would like to be, as people would like for that to happen, what ends up happening is they spend more and buy it even though it has the tariffs on it. All right, and then the final thing that actually happens in the dependency theory is this idea of nationalism or nationalization. And in nationalization, what ended up happening is that the governments will acquire industries that were originally put in by companies or through colonial governments. The government of the now independent colony will buy those operations and then operate them at a national level. And that's all good if the people can afford to buy the products from it, and if the government continues to funnel the product out to the population. But things can fall apart, and that's what we've been seeing in Venezuela now for the last almost 8 years now. So nationalization does not necessarily always work, but it's one of the outcomes of the dependency theory. So I thought this was an interesting map, because what happens when these independent countries try to negotiate on their own to try to do financing without the former colonial powers' influence? Well, China has stepped in. And so I thought this map from the visual capitalist was really interesting, because we have all of this investment, particularly in coastal African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, because China is setting up infrastructures. Well, actually what China is doing is providing loans to these countries to build infrastructure, but the countries are not able to pay the debt service. So what's been gradually happening is that China then, when the countries renege on the debt service of the loans, China's been taking the property back and developing it for themselves. So that's the next step in what is happening as a result of the dependency theory and world systems theory. So let's see how that works. All right, so the last portion here is commodity dependence. So as I already explained what a commodity is, it's a basic resource. Sometimes it's a food product and sometimes it's a heavy mineral, or it's a mineral product or an ore. But what ends up happening is that countries at a particular time in the global economy will focus on a single export. And cacao for a long time set up a large trade network coming out of Ghana and Togo and Cote d'Ivoire. They would raise cacao plantations, and then sugar would be bought from the colonies of the West Indies, and then that would be all sent back to European countries, where then they would mix it with the fine milks that the different dairy operations in Europe would have, and then you have all different varieties of very fine chocolates. While they were acquiring the raw materials, and the final product was being manufactured in your European countries, England, Switzerland, Germany, Italy. And these supplying countries are focusing on one particular raw material. Well, what happens if there is a glut in the market? What happens if there's a failure of that raw material? And that's what we're actually looking at right now with a fungus in bananas and a decline of the cacao production. So, but you have another footprint that happens here with this commodity dependence. And that comes in that we have a distribution of countries where in the red, 80 to 100% of those countries are dependent on 2 or 3 commodities. Okay. That is dangerous for those countries, because if, once again, if the market falls on those, or if the demand is no longer there, God forbid somebody would say that there's something awful about chocolate and we should never eat chocolate. That would devastate not only these economies, but a lot of people's social well-being right now. Anyway, no comments. At any rate, the next thing that you also have is that some of the countries, 85% of the least developed countries are dependent on one or two specific commodities. In the Middle East and North Africa, 65% of these countries right through here are dependent on one commodity. Now, granted, a lot of this is oil and gas, and that is definitely going to be a factor, but right now that is an economic issue with the cost of a barrel of oil, and the competition between OPEC and Russia right now is definitely hurting that market. And that's an example of what happens when you're dependent on these commodities. You can't allow a competition to harm the income that's made from the countries from those resources. All right, so the countries with primary commodity dependence is what this is showing you. Primary commodity dependence is predominantly affecting, as I already said, your less developed countries. And that is because they continue to provide that unique raw material. Coffee can only be raised in certain areas. Higher altitude in your tropic latitudes. So very unique. It needs volcanic rich soils to get the good flavors that are unique to it. Tea has similar conditions. Cacao is a plantation crop. Cinnamon is a plantation crop. Rubber is a plantation crop as well. Very unique commodities that those countries that have those produce for the world market. And when the economy of one of those developing countries begins to fall apart because we no longer need as much rubber, or we no longer need as much coal ore, or we no longer need coffee, that becomes a problem. All right, so let's review. We very quickly went over Rostow's stages of economic growth, tied those stages to a larger global scale of world systems theory, and how the world systems theory of core periphery relationships led to the dependency theory of the periphery and semi-periphery states because of their relationship back to the core, and how that relationship has also been exacerbated or increased because of their dependence on single commodities. That was a lot. That usually takes about a week in class. Okay. So connections to other units, because there's a lot of them. Regional production of goods and services, create unifying patterns of activity. Population distribution is heavily affected by this core periphery relationship. Large rural to urban migration, population pressures, urban stresses also created as a result of population moving in. Your cultural landscape changes as you continue to have more migration coming into the cities in the periphery and the semi-periphery. Our cultural landscape changes in your most developed cities, the ones that are the ones consuming the mass consumption. How does mass consumption change our landscape? Look around us if you live out in a suburban area. That's where you can see it the best a lot of times. And then how does all of this influence our global system of agriculture? It's the global supply chain of export commodities. And so we can take this economic development topic and pull it backwards into four different sections of this course. That's why it's important to be able to understand this. So let's look at some questions. What is the global pattern of economic development? I like that question, because here I get to talk about dependency, commodity theory, Wallerstein, and Rostow all mixed together. And then if I wanted to talk about Rostow and how he's going to influence population change, I can take that and mix it with the demographic transition model. My class, you better pay attention to that. That's one of my favorite questions. All right, and then how does our dependence on an agricultural commodity prevent further development? Do we restrict development because other countries are so dependent on that product that we can't allow them to develop because we've got to have it? Think about that. Think about that. So you can discuss for tomorrow. So once again, if you haven't remembered this from before, college board would like to make sure that everyone has the kind of access that they need, the connectivity that they need in order to plan and prepare for the exam that you're going to take coming up here in the middle of May. So if you are not being able to trust your electronic device that you're using at this time, or you know somebody who can't, please contact cb.org/tech, and there will be somebody to help you out. So y'all take care. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow, same time, same place, same channel. Be sure to look at the practice question. Now, go out for a walk, explore the geography of your world, wash your hands, wear your mask, stay 6 feet apart, and practice safety. Have a great evening, y'all. See you next time. Bye-bye.